Hello, everyone. Welcome. Give a few seconds while everyone kind of trickles in from the waiting room. But thank you all for joining us today. Now, we're kind of at the getting towards the end of summer, so it's like the Sunday of the summer weekend, at least for many of us. So we really appreciate you taking time to be here. We're super excited. We have amazing panelists to talk to us. But we'll go ahead and get started. So this webinar is part of a series that is focused on doing the work when it matters most. And we're really looking at what we do as educational psychologists in this current socio-political climate that we're in. And this isn't necessarily anything new, but it's kind of a different flavor that we're in, and it might be new for some of us too. So we've talked about teaching, we've talked about research. Now we're talking about publishing and specifically publishing equity-focused scholarship. This series is put on by the APA Division 15 Social Justice and Equity and Educate Social Justice and Equity in Education Committee. And I want to say a big thank you to Yin and Joshua as well, and Kimiko for their work on this session. But we'll keep it moving so you can hear more from the panelists who are the more exciting people to hear from. So our presenters, and a really big thank you to each of them. So Dr. Jason Chen is a professor of educational psychology at the William and Mary School of Education. The questions that drive his research have to do with understanding how to design learning environments, especially digital ones, to direct people's motivation toward difficult learning tasks. And he is the co-editor of Educational Psychologist with the Dr. Krista Muse. And then we have Dr. Jessica DeCuir-Gunby, who holds the Robert A. Naslund Chair in Curriculum and Teaching at the University of Southern California and is the executive director of the USC Race and Equity Center. Her scholarship focuses on race and racial identity development, critical race theory, mixed methods research, and emotions and coping with racism. And she is an editorial board member for Educational Psychologist and the former associate editor of Review of Educational Research. And then last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Francesca López, and she is the Jim and Georgia Thompson Distinguished Professor in the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research centers on educational practices and policies that promote equity and belonging for historically marginalized students, particularly multilingual learners and students from racially and linguistically diverse backgrounds. She is the current co-editor of Review of Educational Research and for the Educational Psychology for Policy and Practice, a new journal that is just coming out. And they had their, I want to say, first issue pretty recently, so that's really exciting. And then she's also the former co-editor of the American Educational Research Journal. So thank you all for being here today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can get into hearing from the panelists. This is how we'll go. We have a few questions that we've already came up with before. If you have any clarifying questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll ask those while we're talking so that way we can really learn as much as possible. And then if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, feel free to put that in the chat as well. And we are going to keep track of that in another document and we'll have time for audience questions at the end. But of course, at the end, when we open it for audience questions, if you want to unmute and ask your question, please feel free to as well. And if you're a grad student, a little tip, which I didn't do when I started talking, was it can be helpful to introduce your name and kind of who you are too. So a little networking advice. But I'm Corey Nicolai, which I did not do. But let's get started. And my apologies, my dog is sleeping in the background and he might be snoring. There we go. All right. Well, again, thank you for being here. We want to start out by asking, based upon your role as an editor or board member, how has the socio-political climate impacted the publication of equity-focused work? And then also thinking about your all's perspective as a scholar publishing as well. I'll put that in the chat. And feel free to hop in, and then I can also facilitate by calling on people if we want as well.
I don't mind jumping in first.
So I think in terms of what I've seen, I have seen the uptake of topics. I've seen many more people try to submit work in this space. It seems like it has garnered much more attention, and people tend to see a vehicle for their work that may not have apparently been there before. But at the same time, we are also contending with the fact that many individuals, especially those I think who are in red states, right, might face more fear given the potential consequences that their work might lead to, right? So there's this tension that I've seen where we do definitely see a lot more scholarship that is attempting to contribute to this understanding of equity and how to do it well. Also, work that is talking about the sociopolitical moment that we're living in. We've seen quite a bit of that as well. But it's interesting to see the consequences many people face that if they are in a context where they might become a target, lose their position. We've seen those headlines too, that's something that might be more invisible to those of us who are editors and don't see the consequences, or maybe we would see more work, right? If it weren't for the fact that some people might be afraid to submit their work.
I'll jump on it. What I'm seeing as, an editorial board member, I'm consistently getting articles to review that are equity based or DEI based. In fact, I just reviewed one last week. Um, in fact, this is not hyperbole. I get asked to review an article every single week from some journal, whether it's psychology, education, methods, because I do a lot of work in all those areas. I get asked to review some kind of piece. I declined one yesterday on racial identity in an international context. So I think people are continuing to do this work. And there are a lot of different journals and different areas that are publishing this work. So I don't think there's a lack of that work coming out, as Francesca talked about. But I think it depends. I don't know where the work is coming from. Is it coming from people in places where it is less penalized? I don't know if people in red states are still doing this work as much. I do know that there are, we do have colleagues that they can't get funding to do this work, or they can't, if they're doing this work, they're not going to be able to get reimbursed, just to say, to go travel to present this work. So I think, we need to maybe, even if this work kind of continues to get published, we need to kind of look and see who's publishing the work and where they're coming from in publishing the work.
Hello, it's Jason Chen. I co-edit with Krista Muse, the educational psychologist. Francesca and Jessica are frequent communicators with the journal, and I very much so appreciate their help. I'll say, so the specific question from Corey was based on my role as an editor. How has the sociopolitical climate affected the publication of equity-focused work? I'm going to echo what Jessica and Francesca said. I am seeing no shortage as the editor of a dampening of authors' willingness to publish on the subject. I receive manuscripts all the time that focus on this. I can also say, just based on conversations that I've been a part of, there's also just great interest in publishing work on justice and equity. I will say, though, that this is coming from someone who's co-editing a journal that is not focused on empirical work. I think that's an important context, because folks who are, part of editorial boards of journals that are focused on empirical work, I would imagine are seeing different disturbances, only because, I mean, I can speak personally, I've had funding cut from NSF already myself and from IES because it was focused on equity. So without that funding, you can't do the empirical work, and therefore you can't publish that empirical work, right? But if it's a review journal, or if it's a journal focused on advancing theory, You don't need those data necessarily from your own studies to be able to do that. So I think that there's a different context there, but I can tell you that from the co-editor of a journal that's focused on advancing theory, I have not seen any dampening of interest. So that's important. That's important to note. I know that another thing, and I don't, and Corey, stop me if you're planning to go here already, but I think the the leaders of this panel, Corey being one of them, have also said that like it's important to talk about sort of larger, trends in the review process. And given my role, I have Krista and I have a lot of say in that. And I can tell you that as editors, we are really, really careful about ensuring that we recruit board members who have a demonstrated record of equity-focused scholarship. We also don't want to have like a token, like, oh, we have one or two people on a board of 20, 30, 40 people, right? And so we want to make sure that we're constantly bringing people onto the board who have those expertise so that Jessica and Francesca are not the only ones, receiving manuscripts to review. And that is because that is quite a bit of work to do. And so we want to make sure that given the number of manuscripts that we do review, we want to have some depth on our bench. So that's something that I want to say also.
Yes, thank you all for sharing that. It's really reassuring to hear that maybe there hasn't been a huge impact on there not being this work being submitted. I think sometimes we maybe fear that's what's happening and can then turn into its own thing of us not submitting work because of this fear. And so it's reassuring to hear that's not necessarily the case, but also I think good to keep in mind that it could depend upon state, your career, where you are in it, and then also maybe down the line with funding being cut as well. So as we always say, the landscape is ever changing. And I appreciate also the point to reviewing and how much labor that can be on people who do equity work. And that it's something where we can all kind of have our foot in the door of helping to support people that are doing equity work too, with those reviewing. So thank you all for those answers. For our second question, we wanted to ask what advice you would give scholars whose work is critical, specifically focused on systems of power when they're getting ready to publish as they're going through the process as well.
I'll jump into that this one because this is something, I've been dealing with my whole career. I would recommend, working with journals who have a history of publishing this work, who've consistently published this work. I mean, there are journals who have, I would say, more recently started publishing this work. And I'm not saying that you can't necessarily send your work to those journals because we need to see critical work in all journals, and I'm really proud to see, that EdPsych has really taken a nice turn and has been really more receptive to this work. And I do encourage you to continue to send your work to those EdPsych journals. But I do think for some pieces that, um, depending upon what you're talking about, it may be better to send in this social political climate to send to those journals that have a stronger history of publishing that work because there might be less pushback on what you're saying and what they want you to do. Because I have heard some scholars wanting to publish in some journals that are that publish less critical work, actually, being more critical in terms of, I hate to use the word critical, actually being more conservative in terms of what they're willing to publish now. And so actually being, telling them to change this citation or add this kind of citation, or you shouldn't use this kind of language. And so you're seeing a little bit more of that because I think journals, particularly publishers, are a little afraid about being sued because there have been some cases of publishers being sued. And so you might see some of that. But if you go to journals that have a history of that's what they do, you're less likely to get that kind of pushback. So I think, once you have a manuscript and you're trying to think about a home, I think you need to look and see what else those particular journals have published and to see how well your actual manuscript will fit with the other pieces. Not to say you shouldn't, I push boundaries. So that's what I do. So I don't, so sometimes you do need to say, hey, maybe Ed Psych needs this boundary pushing piece. So, but you just need to weigh it and to really kind of see, is this of time to put it in the Ed Psych piece or Ed Psych journal, or should you go ahead and put this in a more traditional journal, a journal that takes more critical pieces?
I can sort of riff off of what Jessica just said. I think another thing that I've seen, and this is not for educational psychologists, but just what I've seen in other corners, um, is that a lot of times, like what Jessica said, if you if you name specific people, and if those people tend to be hotheads, you might poke the bear, and that can draw some attention to yourself in really bad ways. And so, if you do want to publish in a journal that is a little bit more apprehensive about that, you might think about not naming specific people and calling them out if it works for what your message is trying to deliver. Um, I just think of the Lord of the Rings and Bilbo Baggins and his team, like they were trying to like fight back against an oppressive system by avoiding the evil eye of Sauron. Like you want so if it's appropriate for what you're trying to do, avoiding the evil eye of Sauron could be the way to go. Um, Another thing that I'll just say too is that like you want to make sure that, I mean, everyone does this, but really make sure that whatever you are saying and putting out in print is 100% factually true and citable because you want to have the paper trail. You're being a good journalist, in other words, right? Like triangulate and make sure that like this person said this. If you want to go out, stick your neck out and say that because it works for the kind of piece that you're trying to put out there, great, but really do a good job of having that paper trail triangulated multiple times. I would also just make sure that you talk with the editor ahead of time and just going to say like, hey, I'm going to be submitting this piece. Is this something that you would not even be willing to do, you know, uh, entertain in the first place, just to kind of, get a conversation going and see what happens.
All I'll add to what's already been said is I think there are some um, ways to be able to tell if because journals are structured, they're gatekeeping mechanisms, right? So structures of power are very much present. Who the editor is or editors are, who they've selected to be, if they have associate editors, who they've invited to be on the board, those are all intentional decisions that shape the kind of work that is reviewed and how well it is reviewed. And so I think I would just encourage folks to really look carefully at who's on the board. And, Jason has mentioned explicitly being intentional about including people who can review the work well. You want to be sure that there's a presence. And, as Jessica mentioned, pushing the boundaries a bit, that's fine. It's just those are signals to those of us that are submitting our work that it may be more welcome in this space. They have the appropriate folks on the board who are going to understand this work. Because one of the real consequences of submitting this work to outlets that may not have reviewers who understand the work is you're going to get feedback that is at times pretty egregious. It's, I think Jessica and I have talked about this. We've seen it all in terms of the kind of reviews that we get. And it's a consequence of not having sufficient reviewers, which
I'm just going to pitch this. I think Jason might agree with me. Getting reviews right now is one of the hardest things to do. I've been in an editor capacity for a very long time now, and it's never been as bad as it currently is. People are not willing to review, people are overworked, overloaded, can't do it. So if you have not ever considered entering the space and becoming a reviewer, I highly encourage it. The field depends on it. If you're submitting your work, I think we have a duty to review, because otherwise it's the same people that keep getting tapped to review. So I wanted to make sure to say that. Please make sure that you're paying it forward and reviewing work so that, when you're expecting your work to be reviewed, it's also reviewed by someone who's doing the same.
Yeah, I have to echo that. And I see that Jason puts that in the chat as well. As a associate editor, and I was a associate editor for AERJ as well. That was the hardest job for me, actually getting people to review. And then sometimes, even when they said they would review, getting them to actually turn in the reviews. And and as people who submitted, they would be frustrated because they're like, "Yeah, my article's been under review for I don't know how long." And I'm trying. I had a hard time getting a reviewer, and then now that I got a reviewer, this person is taking a long time to submit this review. So it's frustrating on both sides. I know I've been on the bad end of review processes as well. I had an article literally took 8 months. One of them, I had two on the review. One took 8 months, and the other one took 6 months before I got it in. And on average, that's how long my pieces are taken to actually get reviewed. And I mean, mind you, I told you I'm getting asked to be a reviewer about every week. And they're asking me to turn in things in 3 and 4 weeks. So I'm trying to turn my things over within a month and 6 weeks, but yet my pieces are taking 8 months to get reviewed. I want you to do that math in your head. This is not adding up. And I'm one of those people. I'm tired. I've been reviewing since a graduate student. And so by the time you add all those days, that's pushing up almost 30 years I've been reviewing. I'm tired, you all. I'm ready to stop reviewing. I'm just letting you all know. So if I stop reviewing and Francesca stops reviewing, who's going to be reviewing? I'm just gonna put that question out there because I'm pretty done. I'm just letting you know that's not a hyperbole. That's the truth. That's because we people like me and Francesca, we get overworked because one, we're some of the few people with the expertise in the field, and then we're the people that they know that says yes to reviewing because a lot of people don't review, and then we get overtaxed, and now we're burnt out. At least, let me speak for myself. I'm burnt out.
You're not alone.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone's points on how important reviewing is and how difficult it is often. I think it can be really nice, and I see this in the chat from Adriana too, that sometimes as early career scholars, it can be a little bit intimidating or can be hesitant to sign up. Um, and so Adriana was asking if there's any journals that are open to early career researchers. The other thing I'll say too is there's kind of some safety mechanisms in place too that as a reviewer, I know when I first started reviewing, I was nervous. But you know that the editors or other people are going to look at your review as well. So no one really wants anyone out there saying anything too wild. And I was reassured when I got invited back to keep reviewing. And I was like, okay, so since people are maybe desperate for it, might be the support's welcome a lot. But I would turn that back to the panelist.
I just want to just follow up on what you've just said. I think for those of you that are early career, if you're a graduate student, some journals have not limitations. They will encourage a review, but they want to make sure that somebody that has completed their doctorate is actually the one overseeing it. But it's something I've seen done many, many times. If you're a grad student, you approach your advisor. If you agree to do it, they just kind of mentor you through the process. And as an early career person, reviewing others' work is one of the fundamental ways you learn about the publishing process. It's always important to keep in mind you're giving constructive, respectful feedback, right? That you would give to a peer if you knew who they were. That anonymity should not be, I mean, it's rare, but it happens where somebody says things that they would never say to a person to their face, right? So it's treat someone the way you'd want to be treated, but you have quite a bit to say, right? So I don't think it should preclude you from reaching out to journals. I can tell you, in my experience, they would welcome anybody reaching out to them and saying, I'd like to be a reviewer. They will take you up on that offer, I promise.
Yeah, I agree with Jessica and Francesca for sure. Journals are very willing to sort of put names into the list as people who can review. If you're a doc student or a grad student, definitely pair up with your advisor, because if you submit a review, um, a lot of times your advisor will get asked to review, and then they might ask a doc student to sort of help write it, or that sort of thing. I know that my own advisor did that all the time with me. And if your advisor has not, I'd ask them. I'd be like, hey, can I help write some reviews with you? That is a really important part of your sort of academic, skills to develop. Because the better you can do that, the better you can sort of write manuscripts yourself. So I would definitely do that.
Yes, and not to feed a fed horse, but it can be so helpful to do that reviewing. You also get to see the other reviewers' comments, the editors' comments, and that can be really helpful, especially if you want to like submit to that journal. You'll see what people are kind of looking for. Also, if your prospectus being asked to look at that journal, that could potentially be like also a signal to you as well. And one thing I'll give my unsolicited advice, because I'm not the panelist on here, I just volunteered myself to facilitate. But something that I do when reviewing too is really try to take a very formative approach and imagine, and maybe this might ruffle some feathers, but imagine it's like one of my graduate students or my undergrads that's writing too, and just try to make it really formative. And how can that paper be the strongest it can when it like goes out to the world? And then also paying attention to if there's like a fatal flaw that something very strange is being said or something's being overlooked. It can be really helpful too, because I care a lot about this equity work. So it's kind of nice to give my 2 cents when I'm reviewing too. Um, but okay, no one's here to hear me say that. Um, our next question. So we've already touched on this a little bit in some of the answers to other comments, but it seems, and I am an early career scholar as well, but it does seem with like journals getting sued and publishers getting sued that there is maybe a different relationship that's happening now with publishers and like what's getting published. Again, with my knowledge of critical race theory, I'm sure this is nothing really that new. It's just packaged differently. But we were wondering a little bit more about how do the publishers also wield power to control what's being published in a journal or limit it?
I don't know if you wanted to take this one first, Jason, or I can jump in.
You can go, yeah, go for
Okay.
it.
Um, So my experience with the has been with Sage primarily and now APA. And I don't see any hesitancy at all in terms, in fact, they are very removed from the process. And there are only internal things that go on that are escalated that happen before it even gets to us. And it's beyond the scope of the conversation here, but it has to do with other countries. Um, and to my knowledge, we just get all of the papers. I've never had a situation where somebody from Sage or APA tells me or anyone on the team that work can't be published. Um, that has just not happened. It doesn't mean it will never happen. It's just one of those things that from my experience, value and trust the process and the process of identifying editors is pretty rigorous. And so I think once they put that trust in the people who are making those decisions, they do not interfere. They may be brought in if there are issues to deliberate on things, but I've never seen that be the case. So, and I hope it stays that way. But Jason, have you seen it differently?
So the question, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this. How do publishers wield power to limit what is published in a journal? Right, that being the question.
Sure.
I would, so I'm sure a lot of folks would probably already like intuitively know what the answer is, but like I'll just like let's play a thought experiment. Like imagine that you're a publisher, right? Um, what would you do? Well, first of all, like why would you do it? I think the why has already been sort of mentioned, right? You don't want to get sued. You're getting a lot of like negative attention, right? You want to take the eye of Sauron off of you. But like if you were a publisher, what might you do? Any 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 guesses? Feel like if I were a publisher, I'd like the point that I would like where I would have influence would be on the editors, right? Like Francesca has described her own experience as the editor of a journal. I personally have not experienced any kind of pressure. In fact, I've gotten nothing but positive support. Um, um, I can also just say that like Krista and I we do a lot of behind the scenes work because we know that other journals have done this. We know that other journals have placed pressure on the editors. And because of that, we've sort of done our own sort of like internal like talking with our publisher and different people in the same publishing, right? Because it's Taylor and Francis and APA that that sort of oversee us. And so we've had those conversations with different people at TNF and with APA. And they're abhorred by they're like mortified by the fact that other publishers have squashed what people say and have I've been impressed because they've been able to very quickly cite company policy that says we will make sure that free speech is that people have free speech, that we will not squash speech, and that this is where our publishers have said like, but at the end of the day, like what people say has to be verifiable. That's why I say make sure you can leave a paper trail and that it's factual, right? So long as that's the case, our publishers are like, we trust you as the editors. We are not going to interfere. And so that's a big part.
But I do think it does put a lot more pressure on people who are doing DI work that our citation processes are overly scrutinized, whereas people who are not doing DI work, their citations are not as scrutinized. I'm not saying people don't look at their citations to make sure that they're actual citations, things like that. But, we have to be extra careful in what any claim we make has to be, like I said, double checked and triple checked and make sure we have this high paper trail. Whereas someone else doing work that has nothing to do with diversity, they can say whatever, put one citation or whatever, and no one even bats an eye. And so that's extra work that we have to do that others don't have to do. So, I mean, so that's extra labor that we have to put in an article. And then even sometimes, even when we say that, and we have all that, there still might be an editor that might say, oh, okay, that's still a little incendiary. You might want to consider changing that language because of what you're talking about, because we are still in this interesting climate. Because I've seen a lot of people talking about having written certain things, and then the editors telling them, "Look, we want to publish this piece, but the way you phrase it, being asked to rephrase certain things." And so, you're pushed up against, the freedom of speech, academic freedom. But then when you want to say things a certain way, they're like, no, we don't want you to say it because, our publishers are getting a little antsy about that. And so, but to be on the other side, the publishers are like, look, the publishers do want people to kind of say what they want to say, but they are a business and they don't want to be sued. And they're not going to court for you in your little article, right? I know that article is important to you, but it's not important to these big companies. Their bottom line, and they're not going to fight and spend millions of dollars so you could publish your one little article. That's not going to happen. And so you as a scholar, you have to make that choice. Do I want to change these sentences or two? Or am I going to make a stand and just pull my article from this journal and maybe publish it somewhere else if I could get it published somewhere else? And I know that has a lot of repercussions because for people, because you might be an early career scholar, you have tenure on the line, like you might not be able to just pull this. Plus, like if you just like me, like I was just talking about, you had this piece under review for 8 months. And you just had been waiting. And now all of a sudden, you're close to getting it published. And now you have to fight in the publication process because they want you to change language on certain things. So you have to figure out, are these things I'm willing to compromise? Am I going to compromise on this language? From a publisher's perspective, they're like, oh, it's just a few words. It's just, it's just a little language change. But really, is it? It may be going against everything that you're talking about in your very article. So it's a lot of different things you need to take in consideration, but it is extra work that we have to do doing this work that others aren't doing.
100% agree with Jessica. And this is the big challenge of doing this work, right? Like so far, we've been saying like we're seeing no diminishment in interest in this work, but the toll is real. And Jessica said it right there, right? That's the big challenge. It reminds me of what Toni Morrison said about the white gaze, right? This is where scholars are doing this work and they're just trying to justify their work, their experiences around the assumed white default. Like that's what that is. And so when you're doing that work, you're constantly fighting against that white gaze, right? So that's the toll it takes. And Jessica's exactly right.
Yes, thank you all for sharing that. Sounds like there are um, really promising cases where our freedom of speech is being protected and supported, and publishers are really trusting the, for better or worse, system that we've had in place for getting articles published for a long time. And then we also have now this kind of running into it with capitalism and being scared of being sued, and the money's going to be more important when it comes down to it than maybe our own work. And so I appreciate that perspective. I wanted to offer too, is with the citations, it can be difficult with critical work. A lot of our work is theoretical and conceptual, and that doesn't often hold the same power as an empirical, especially like an experimental or quasi-experimental. And so that can be another thing that can be hard too, is justifying even with the citations that are maybe looking at history and policy, but not having like an experiment, because you can't do that necessarily in some cases. So our last question that we have prepared, and then we already have questions rolling in from the audience, but feel free to keep asking them, is what advice would you give to scholars who don't do critical work but want to support others who do?
I'll just get something started. Just say like read, right? If you don't do the work yourself, read the work. And read in conversation with those who do that work. I think that, it's helpful to have advocates. It's helpful to have people who are going to advocate for your work. Maybe one day, if you're not, you'll receive a manuscript that you have to review that's doing critical work, and because of the conversations you've had with people doing critical work and the work that you're reading, you'll be able to do a better job of advocating for it. I think that's one step. So educating yourself by reading. You got to read that work to be able to speak that work and to review that work. And don't do it in isolation, do it in conversation with others.
I think what I'd add to that is if you have a seat at a particular table, make sure that you make space for those critical voices. I mean, in my experience, there are many amazing scholars who were not engaged in critical work, but they knew the power that there was in having a seat at the table. And so they made spaces and shaped journals with those decisions because they didn't have all of the knowledge, but they knew that other people would. So making that intentional, I think, is absolutely imperative.
Right. And I totally agree with both of them. And I'll also add, and also we need to make sure they're including critical work in the canon. And so as you are putting your syllabi together in the beginning of the semester, include those critical voices in those kind of core readings as you kind of have that motivation course you're putting together. Make sure you have those critical motivation articles in there. Or if you're putting that survey ed psych class together, have those critical readings in there. And so once you begin to kind of normalize critical work in ed psych, others will be able to see it the same way. And so it'll be kind of just a kind of part of when you think about ed psych, you think about all these variety of approaches to ed psych, and critical will become a part of that.
And to riff off of what you just said, Jessica, cite that work too. Again, as I think Corey had posted it earlier in the chat, like citations do carry weight. And so the more that you can cite that work, the better. And so that's one way you can advocate for that kind of work. So cite it.
Oh, and to that, download it. So one of the things that I think is really important when I was sitting at the last conference that I was at, one of the metrics that they looked at, yes, citations matter, how often it's cited and the impact factor and all of that, of course, right? That's something that they look at. But how many times articles have been downloaded? And I will say that critical work coming into the journals, and the spike in how many downloads was something that the publisher is really paying close attention to in a good way. So, I mean, it's capitalism. They care that the work is getting out there, but there are times that it can benefit. Um, so yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you all for those answers. So reviewing, citing, downloading, we can do having conversations with each other, really listening. And at the end of the session, we'll share chances that you can have conversations about this at APA, at the annual conference that we're putting on. But I want to turn it over to the audience questions while we have some time. There was a question from Adriana, I'm going to put it in the chat. But working with public schools using engagement strategies that avoid DEI language because of the pressure on public schools, but looking for advice around data collection and designing studies for potential publication where they're navigating those conceptual and theoretical differences. But I'll put it in the chat and it'll probably be much better how Adriana put it.
I'm not sure if my question makes sense, but for a little bit of context, as an early career scholar, I'm like, thinking about upcoming school year and, putting together my research proposal and so that I can go to my administrators and see if they'll let me go in and talk to their teachers, right? Um, because of that, I have to be very intentional about the language that I use to get their buy-in, to get the access, right? So I'm not using a lot of the words that I would use when I write and publish. Um, and I'm also prioritizing like the relationship building, right? And so that transparency piece is something that I've been trying to be intentional about. Um, but I also want to be able to use this data to do the DEI work. And they are doing DEI work, right? They just don't use that language. They don't use theory, do those things. So I need to like say, go into a school and put together a research proposal that can advance DEI work, but not package it as DEI, if that makes sense, right? That's the thing that I'm thinking about right now.
I mean, I think there's a lot in what you've shared. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that you're being very thoughtful and intentional that, and because let's face it, in academic work, there's a lot of jargon. And I know when I've worked with schools, they're like, bring the theory down. Like it's not consequential to them. And if you're trying to get buy-in, you want to make sure that the study is as transparent as possible. And including everything you would in a theoretical framework, that is not the vehicle to do that. So it sounds to me that you're, navigating a very appropriate tension, that you want to make sure you're using the language that is accessible to the people you are recruiting so that they have a fair understanding of what it is that you're asking them to do. But that is not what you need to do when you then prepare your work for publication, right? That is drawing on theories that may be language that, creates tension, right? If you were to use that in the district. And
Yeah.
I think, so one of the things that I've often actually always done is I offer to give the district or the schools like a report. And the report gives in lay language the findings that might be useful to them because it should be this bidirectional situation where you're getting to do research at a location, but they should have something to gain from their engaging in this process with you, right? So making sure that, and I think it's excellent practice for everybody, right? To have to write for an audience that is much more general than the academic audience that is used to all the terminology that we use. So I think that that's super appropriate, and that if you're worried about transparency, giving them, the report that you're submitting so that they have it for their records, is something that they may want. And if they engage in questions, that might be a further conversation. But that makes total sense, I think, to most of us who are in situations where we're working with schools and districts.
I think that, and so like, I think one of the things that I'm struggling with the most are measures. And I'm struggling a little bit too in designing like interview protocols and things like that. Um, because I'm thinking about publishing and the tools that we use and the quality of those tools matter, right? If we're using surveys, we care about reliability and validity, and we care about whether those measures align with how theoretical constructs are operationalized. Um, the problem is that when I put together that report and sent it to my director, the things that he found most helpful were things, communication strategies, send emails, GChat, right? Like very practical logistical things. So when they are talking about data that they need, it's that. And like the theory doesn't come in at all. So I'm trying to find out what the balance is.
I think sometimes, when working with schools, I mean, Jason, I jumped in, I didn't see you unmute, but I think sometimes when you're working with schools, I mean, you may have an idea kind of what your idea is about, but in schools, um, they may have read your proposal in terms of what you say you're doing, but they still kind of think, oh, we can get them to do this. These are all the stuff that we need. And they're wanting you to do all these other things that are beyond the scope of what your study is intending to do. I just think you need to kind of just be clear and say, these are the things I want to do. However, you know, I would more than happy to work with you to help to design something else, and maybe talking to them about ways that you can collaborate with them to help them to gather some of the information they need in another study or, a project that you work with them. But I think you just need to be kind of clear about this is kind of what I need to, what I'm trying to work on for my study. And then you could just kind of, because once you build that relationship with them, you have that relationship with them. And then you could kind of, and that could be a way for you to give back to them, that you could maybe kind of come back and do some project for them. They're just for them, collecting data for them that they need, that they want. And that way you're not muddling up the data that you need for your study.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Francesca. I feel like that's what I would say as well. And let me just kind of preface this part by just telling maybe a quick story. So like I was facing very similar sort of experiences too when I was a grad student. And I would say that so I happen to be very fortunate to be taking a methods course from this person named Vanessa Siddle Walker, who happened to be the AERA president a number of years ago. She was a very excellent advisor to me when I was trying to conduct a study. And I went to her with a problem one time, and I was just like, Dr. Siddle Walker, listen, something's not adding up. I'm looking at these data. It's a qualitative study I was doing. Something just doesn't make sense. And I did that like a couple weeks in a row, and she was like, Jason, listen. So she wrote a very well-known book, and she had to do a lot of research in sort of rural areas of Mississippi, primarily Black populations. And she was like, she learned something where she was like um, getting some very similar things with herself too, because at the time she was a postdoc at Penn. She had done her doctorate at Harvard. And I think a lot of folks she was working with were like, I don't know if I trust you. And she was like, I think that people are getting the same sort of vibe with you, that maybe they don't trust you yet. And so she was like, at one point in my research for this book, I I was talking with somebody, and they said, you know why we don't trust you is because you're not down here washing the greens. And she goes, what? Because and so at some point she's just like, okay, if I want to earn people's trust, I've got to get in there, and they've got to know that I'm here for the long run, and that I'm not just being extractive and taking data and leaving and whatever, right? And just writing my good book and just saying bye-bye to everybody, right? So she was like, I have to build that trust, and I have to like get in there and wash greens. And so she was like, Jason, you got to get in there and wash some greens. Not literally, but figuratively. Like you're not in rural communities, in farming communities washing greens, but you got to do your version of washing greens. And my version of washing greens was I was working with a particular school, and they were interested in accomplishing something. And so they were like, yo, you've got some expertise in this. Can you help? And so I was like, yeah, I'll help you. Right. And I want to be someone who can be facilitated for you. And so, I was just very clear with them. I was like, listen, I need this. I know that y'all need this, and I'm happy to work with you to get that kind of data, for your needs. Can we also do this and get the data that I need? And so there's that sort of collaborative sort of partnership that I think Jessica and Francesca were talking about. And so, just keep that story in mind. Like you're washing the greens. That's what it is, right? You have to demonstrate to the community that you're in there with them, collaborating and partnering with them.
Just thank you all for your thoughts on that. Very important. It's like building that trust. And Caleb, I see your hands raised. If you want to ask your question, please feel free to.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much to the panelists today. It was really interesting to me. I'm a rising senior going to Pomona College. and I'm really interested in pursuing a PhD in ed psych. And so I very much know very little about what the publishing world looks like. So it was really cool to hear a little bit, get a little insight into that. I think a lot of what I know is the hate that equity focused research is receiving right now. And so I'd be curious to know what your recommendations would be for, an undergrad who's just getting into this world, and kind of being told that I should be pessimistic about my research interests.
No, don't be pessimistic. I know we're limited on time. Like, do not listen to the haters. I think across my career, I've always had folks kind of like, oh, I don't do that work anymore. People don't support it. Don't listen to them. They don't have a vested interest in it if they're that ready to give it up. No. I think very briefly, I'd say look for programs where you're going to have an opportunity to work with someone that will give you the exposure to get to publish. It's a learning process. And you don't have to know it the moment you get in. Somebody said it, you are so ahead of the game. I mean, really, you are so ahead. Um, Look for people that you admire, have conversations with them, ask them about their program, what it looks like, how they support students. And I would love to see you part of the EdSite community. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, my whole career, like no one did the work I did. I was like, okay, that's a challenge, you know. And so I just, I knew the work that I did I was interested in was important. So I continued to just kind of make my own way. And it's been a challenge, but I do the work I do because it's important to me. Studying the experiences of African Americans is important because that's, the community that I'm part of, and I know it's a good work. And so I continue to do the work that I want to do. And so if this is the work that you want to do, you love, you do it. And it doesn't matter what other people say. And we need this energy.
Everything that Jessica and Francesca just said, yes. I echo that. Caleb, what brought you into this place in the first place? Like what got you excited about ed psych and doing equity focused work?
I think, well, thank you first for those responses. It's definitely what I'm hearing. I'm currently at UW-Madison and their summer education research program. And I'm seeing that there are pockets of incredible people like you all really advocating for this. And so there is optimism. I think I just like look at and hear that it's not the best conditions, but I guess like you all said, that's not reason to continue, working down the path. But for me, I would say I was always interested in magic as a child, cognition. And so that brought me into psychology, but very much raised in kind of a Afrocentric, Black focused environment, raised in DC. And so I combined my interest in psychology with kind of more sociological perspectives of Black studies, Black education. And so I'm really interested in fostering belonging and agency, and academic identity in Black students, using social psychological perspectives and interventions. So I would say that's a little glimpse of how I got here. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Yeah. Well, you've got someone at UW-Madison who's also on this panel, who does this kind of work. And like I'd say like just hang out with people who give you energy. Because I mean you really need that energy to sustain a career. That's kind of what you're looking at, like a career takes energy, and even when you're hating, when you're disliking something, you've got to love it enough and have that energy to keep going through it. So hang out with and learn from mentors who you get energy from. And so that's what I'd say. Glad you're here.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. And I'm going to add my 2 cents, apparently. I didn't know this when I applied for PhD programs, so I'll pass it on in case you don't know, was that you are also applying to work with a specific person there, which really helps make things much more manageable. I was trying to look at any program there ever was about educational psychology or human development. That's not how you go about it. You look at the person whose research really resonates and who you'd like to have like as a mentor with there. And we have a really good community, I think, in EdPsych. A lot of people on this call, and like Dr. Jessica DeCuir-Gunby, Dr. Francesca López, Dr. Jason Chen, they've all been a huge part of making EdPsych this space that where we talk about equity all the time. And then I'll pivot into more places that you guys can find this community. So we'll have this talk uploaded on our APA Division 15 YouTube channel. So you'll be able to review this talk. There's also our previous talks from the webinars that are there. And then upcoming for our APA annual conference, we have a bunch of very exciting activities and events that are going on that are hosted by the Social Justice and Equity and Education Committee. There's going to be a site visit to a museum with the DSMRI folks on Thursday at 11:30 during the conference. We'll also have our critical conversation at the annual conference on Thursday as well, where a few of the people that are on this call, Dr. Yin Chen, Dr. Adriana Martinez Calvet will be there presenting their equity work too, and we'll talk about theory from critical and culturally relevant lenses. And then we'll also have a social hour on Thursday at the conference as well for all of us to just kind of get that community, have those conversations that people mentioned, and not feel so pessimistic or so alone. It's really important to find that community and be able to fill up our cups. So thank you all for joining today. It's really wonderful to have people here. And again, thank you to our panelists for all of your responses and sharing your insight and expertise with us. So thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye.